Hey guys, it's Mr. Penguinpanda and I'm really excited because this time around I'm going to talk about some of the mechanics of Stardew Valley. In particular, I'm going to explain how damage and crit chance is calculated in this game. If you're like me, you've probably wondered for a long time how attack buffs and the different professions like fighter, brute or desperado work, or if there's a difference between the iridium band and the ruby ring, and also how everything interacts with each other. I think it's very difficult to find any information online about this, and that's the reason I've spent the last few days going through some parts of the code to understand many things, and I'm going to share my results with you. Also, I'm going to make this a series called the Stardew Valley Mechanics series. So, if you're interested in watching more of that, subscribe and also hit the bell to get notified of new videos. So let's get started. First, let's talk about weapons, their stats and their description. The minimum and maximum damage are pretty self-explanatory. When damage is calculated, you will roll a whole number between the minimum and the maximum damage. The crit chance is the likelihood of you making a critical strike when hitting a monster. But you might be wondering, the iridium needle for example has a 10% base crit chance. But then why does it say it has a +6 crit chance in the item description? So the first thing to know is that in Stardew Valley 1.5, dagger crit chances were improved slightly. When you use a dagger, 0.5% gets added to its existing crit chance. After that, you multiply your crit chance by 1.12, so the iridium needle actually has a 11.76% crit chance. But in the description, it's around half the value except for some rounding. The reason for that is probably that usually most weapons have a 2% crit chance. So the +6 crit chance in the item description means that the weapon crits 6 times more than a regular weapon. So what is crit power? Crit power relates to the amount of damage you do when you land a crit. The exact factor your damage gets multiplied by is the crit multiplier. Usually that's 3, so most weapons do 3 times the damage when you land a critical strike. For example, the iridium needle has a crit power of +200. If you divide the crit power by 50, you get the additional crit multiplier. So the iridium needle has an added crit multiplier of 4. If we add this to the base amount, we get that it does 7 times the damage when it crits. Otherwise, I think the rest of the weapon stats are pretty uninteresting, except maybe for the speed. The weapon level below the weapon's name doesn't really do anything. It's probably just to give players a grasp of how strong a weapon is compared to some other weapons. The weapon speed, however, determines how fast your weapon swings. This once again is relative to the base amount, which is -8 for hammers and 0 for all other weapons. How exactly weapon speed is calculated is a little bit more complicated, and I don't think it's that interesting. The weight just tells you how far away a monster is knocked back when you hit it with a weapon. Once again, this just relates to the base amount weapons of the same type have. So a claymore knocks monsters 30% further away compared to swords with no added weight. And otherwise your weapon can also have added defense that only gets applied when you have it selected. But how exactly defense affects the damage you take will be for another video. So what happens when you improve your weapons in the forge? Their stats get increased directly, which is also displayed in the item description. All the existing forging bonuses are additive except for the ruby upgrade. So forging your weapon with a jade would increase the crit multiplier of the iridium needle to 7.1. But the ruby one instead increases the minimum and maximum damage by a factor of 0.1 for each level. So 3 ruby enchantments would increase the weapon damage to 1.3 times its value. Now let's continue with rings. Rings increase the so-called modifiers of your character. Right now only rings can increase your modifiers. This includes the ruby, emerald, jade, aquamarine and amethyst ring as well as the iridium band. So when you equip a ruby ring, your attack modifier gets increased to 0.1. Put on an iridium band as well and this gets added up to 0.2, which means there's no difference between those two rings despite their different descriptions. In the same way, a jade ring would increase the crit power modifier by 0.1. All these modifiers just multiply your weapon stats before damage is calculated, so it's not in the weapon description. One thing to keep in mind is that all the modifiers of rings don't affect the special attack from hammers and clubs right now in 1.5.4. Maybe this is intentional, or maybe this is a bug, I don't know. And as a last step before the damage calculations begin, your crit chance gets multiplied by 1.5 if you have the Scout profession. And what's very interesting is that luck increases your chance to crit at this point. Every point of luck from food or rings increases your crit chance by 2.5%. So if I had 5 luck and a 10% crit chance, this would get multiplied to reach a total of 11.25% crit chance instead. If you've watched one of my other videos about the Iridium Needle, you might remember that I said that it could reach a maximum of around 43% crit chance. With this information, however, we know that this was actually incorrect. With the dagger buffs that I didn't include last time, and the increase from luck buffs that I didn't know about, you can actually reach a 60% crit chance by using the same setup as in my other video. You just have to increase your luck level to +9. You can get +5 luck from a magic rock candy, +2 from 2 lucky rings combined with the aquamarine rings, and +2 from ginger ale with key seasoning. Now let's get to the actual damage rolls. The first thing that happens is that you roll a number between the minimum and maximum damage after all the enchantments and rings are applied. If you roll a crit, the damage now gets multiplied by a crit multiplier. And you might be wondering, but what about the Desperado profession? Well, this is factored in later. What comes into play first are buffs that increase your damage. Every point of attack from food buffs like the Root Splatter or the Warrior Ring increase the damage you deal by a flat amount of 3. So a Magic Rock Candy would give you 15 extra damage, while a buff from the Warrior's Ring would increase the damage by 30. In the same way, if you get debuffed by a Magma Sparker, your damage will get reduced by 9, while the debuff from the Blue Squid decreases your damage by 60. But all of this happens after the crit calculation, so this flat amount doesn't get increased. But that's before any of the professions that affect the damage come into play. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to use some mods. So I'll first remove all the skills I have, give myself a carving knife, and make a tiger slime. As you can see, my carving knife deals 1, 2 or 3 damage on this tiger slime, which has 0 defense. I can also deal 3, 6 or 9 damage if I crit. But now when I eat the Magic Rock Candy, I get +5 attack. This increases my damage to 16, 17 or 18 damage every hit. So this works especially well with fast hitting weapons like the dagger or its special move where you stab 4 times in quick succession. Another good use would be when you start a new save, since in the early game this might increase your damage substantially. But as you can see, when I crit I only deal 18, 21 or 24 damage because the flat 15 damage doesn't get increased by my crit multiplier. If I equip the Warrior Ring and also spawn some green slimes to proc it more easily, I suddenly do around 47 damage with every hit, even when I'm not critting. And only now, after the food buffs, profession bonuses get applied. Fighter increases your damage by 10% and rounds it up. Brute does the same but with 15%. Besides some rounding, this amounts to a 26.5% damage increase. Now, if you instead have the Desperado profession and landed a critical strike before, your damage gets doubled at this point. So compared to the crit multiplier, the Desperado skill does affect the damage you get from food buffs or the Warrior Ring. So a Warrior Ring could potentially give you 60 extra damage if you crit with Desperado, or 38 damage if you have Fighter and Brute. Once again, I'm going to demonstrate it. We have the same weapons and buffs, but this time I'm going to take the Desperado profession. As you can see, I can suddenly crit for 36, 42 or 48 damage, because the damage from the Magic Rock Candy gets doubled for 30 extra damage. And as a last step, before you have to subtract the enemy's defense, all the enchantments that affect the damage get applied. This includes doubling the damage if you have the Buckkill enchantment, or a 50% damage increase from the Crusader enchantment if you attack the right types of monsters. And now I'm going to do one last fun demonstration. I put on a combination of a warrior ring, aquamarine ring and 2 jade rings and forged my carving knife with 3 rubies. I also enchanted with the buckle enchantment and head to the mines. I try to kill some monsters until I get the warrior buff and can hit the bug. And finally, after a few minutes, I land a crit and deal 264 damage with one of the weakest weapons in the game by using the power of knowledge. I'm going to summarize everything again, but before that, I'd appreciate it if you give the video a like and also subscribe if you want to see the next parts of this series. I also made a Google Spreadsheet which I'll put in the description down below, where you can choose from different kinds of equipments and monsters to calculate your damage. So to summarize everything, to calculate your damage, multiply your minimum and maximum damage with your attack modifier from your rings. Take a random whole number between them or the minimum and maximum, whatever you want. Multiply your damage with your crit damage modifier if you've landed a critical hit. Add your attack buffs together, subtract any potential debuffs and then add 3 times this number to your damage. Multiply your damage with the fighter and brute profession separately if you have them. If you landed a critical strike before, double your damage if you have the desperado profession. Once again, double your damage when you have the buckle enchantment or multiply it by 1.5 for the crusade enchantment if you hit the right monster type. And as a last step, subtract your damage by 1 for each point of armor the enemy monster has. And with all this information, tell me in the comments what your favorite combinations of weapons, rings and enchantments is, and what other mechanics you would like to see me explain. I have a lot of things already in mind, but I'd love to hear your opinion. I hope this was helpful in any way, and what you do with this information is up to you. Maybe if you want to make a mod, you could use this information to balance combat. I personally just think it's pretty cool to finally understand the way damage is calculated in Stardew Valley. Next time I'm going to show you some more interesting mechanics, so until then, have a nice day and see you in my next video.